So, tuning spinal stiffness and the continuum of spinal stiffness and how it relates to how it's going to shape somebody's training program based upon their needs and what they need to be able to do with their spine. So first we need to understand that the big non-negotiable is actually the shape of your discs. And there's basically two main categories we can put people into. So again, those who are familiar with the work of Dr. Stuart McGill will know that on one end of the spectrum we have people with very symmetrically shaped discs or ovoid shaped discs. So these people are genetically better suited to more bending and twisting in their spine before damage occurs. That's not to say that eventually damage would occur, but they've got a much more higher tolerance to it before problems occur. The opposite end of that on the spectrum is a more of a limacon shaped disc here, which is less symmetrical. You see it's got that kind of almost like a lima bean kind of shape to it. And these people are more genetically better suited for stiffness, stability and bearing great load through the spine before a problem will occur. So if we were to look at a kind of a spectrum of sports or skills or things that people do, the very far end for an ovoid, flexible person would be someone like a contortionist who can bend and twist their spine and their body into the shape of a pretzel. And because of the shape of their discs, the chance of them getting a damage to the spine from that sort of movement is pretty low. The opposite end, someone with a limacon shaped disc, they're the sort of people better suited to things like powerlifting and strongman, because the shape of their discs is better designed to be locked together to generate great stiffness and bear a lot of compression as well, like things like squats, for example. And again, they're going to thrive in those sort of sports because they've got the right disc shape to do it. The trade-off is that because they're genetically better suited to stiffness and bearing load, that when they try and move in towards a more flexible end of the spectrum here, their chances of injury start to raise quite dramatically. So again, it's, the non-negotiable is you're either kind of one way or the other. And that basically dictates which end of the spectrum you're most likely to thrive at and least likely to get injuries at. So that's not to say that you could be born slightly more towards one or the other, and then through training adaptation come somewhat into the opposite end of the spectrum. It just means that the more you try and move away from the benefits of your genetics and move more towards the weaknesses of your genetics, your risk of injury starts to grow up quite significantly, and it's almost impossible to hit the far reaches of the opposite end of the spectrum from where you're at without getting some sort of horrible injury. And again, it's about where your genetics are and where you're best suited to thrive. So again, if you want to be one way or the other, step one was to pick the right parents. So that's something we can't negotiate with, but again, that's the same for a lot of sports. Is the biggest advantage is how your genetics, if you've got the right advantages tailored to your sports. What we'll find as well is that for, apart from the things on the far reaches, a lot of sports are generally somewhere around the middle, and they require what we call like a tuned stiffness. So what that means is that for a person to be efficient and therefore have greater success at their sport, have less injury, but also perform better, we need to tune that spine to specific demands of their sport. And again, hopefully underlying, they've got the right genetics. So for example, golf is a good example where generally, a lot of top flight golfers, if you looked at their spines, they're far more likely to be ovoid in shape. Because all that twisting off the driving range in particular, if you've got a limacon shaped spine, tends to put a lot of rotational stress on your spine and can lead to things like annular tears and all sorts of other damage. So generally, by the law of survival of the fittest, most of the guys that make it to sort of top flight levels in golf have got ovoid shaped spines, because those are the ones that will bear all that twisting without giving you less sort of damage and problems and pain. So for a golfer, ideally we want someone with an ovoid shaped disc, And then what we need here is we've got to be careful that we don't want them to be super stiff all the time, because it's going to make their swings very inefficient. So for example, if you give a golfer lots of deadlifts to do, it's probably going to detune their ability to have a nice, safe, efficient swing. Rather, what we need to do is to tune them so they can sort of dance around the middle between being flexible and stiff, so that, for example, as they come up to drive and they pull back, they're nice and flexible, and then as they come down and they address the ball and they make contact, that split second, they're stiff to transfer the energy into the ball, and then they can relax again with the follow through. So we need to teach them to, for the most part, they're going to be flexible and relaxed, and then when they need to make contact with that ball, that split second, they go stiff and then they relax. So the important thing with a lot of sports is the ability to generate stiffness, but then particularly how quickly you can relax is going to dictate your efficiency and effectiveness of that particular sport. Another example would be like a boxer or someone who does MMA, like a striking based sport. Imagine a boxer, they're loose, they can bob and weave, they're relaxed, and what actually happens is as they go to throw a punch, there's a pulse to initiate the movement of the punch, and then bang, there's a pulse at the end as they transfer the energy, and then they relax again. It's almost like a double pulse. So again, those who are familiar with the work of Stuart McGill will know that he found this with working with Georges St. Pierre, obviously the famous MMA fighter, and Georges was aware of that double pulse, so he could feel his body was doing a double pulse. So a pulse to initiate the strike, and a pulse as he made contact, and then he relaxed again, nice and efficient. So again, if we're working with athletes or people who want to get into a particular sport, the better we can understand the needs of their sport and what their core and their spine needs to do, the far greater chance of success they're going to have, but also the far greatly reduced risk of injury they're going to have as well. So again, it's about knowing the needs of the sport, and then what end of the spectrum do we need to put people, or do they need to be somewhere in the middle, like an elastic-based athlete where we can fine-tune them at certain times to fire and relax very quickly to keep them efficient. So obviously, this continuum kind of is, if we understand that continuum, we know that each person needs to be somewhere on that continuum, we can fine-tune them. But what are the actual adaptations that occur in the spine? And that's what I'll look at next. So, on top of where your genetics are, what are the things when we train and do exercises, how does the spine adapt to kind of move you more towards one end of the spectrum versus the other, and where can potential problems start to occur? So, with the continuum of tuned stiffness, so we've already taken into account genetics, because you can't really change that. Not yet, anyway. But what are the sort of adaptations that when we train in a particular way, how does the spine adapt to let us sort of move along that continuum sort of one way versus the other, whether it's to be more flexible or to have more stiffness and bear great load? And also, how does that relate to how we need to program training and how we need to let the body, the spine actually adapt to the things that we're trying to do, so that we can maximize adaptation, but also reduce the risk of injury with overtraining people when their systems are kind of under recovered. So there's a few things we can look at. So I, excuse the crude drawing here of some lumbar vertebrae, discs, and some muscles in between the lumbar vertebrae. So what are the things we can look at? So we will look at how the disc can be adapted, how the vertebrae can be adapted, and then how the actual muscles themselves can be adapted as well to help us sort of move along that continuum. One of the first things to look at is the disc itself. So what we need to be careful of is that we talk about the ovoid versus the limacon shaped discs. If you have someone who wants to be very flexible and bendy and twisty, even if you have a very ovoid shaped disc, you still have a finite amount of flexion and twisting in that spinal structure before you start to delaminate the collagen fibers in those discs. What happens when you delaminate a collagen fiber? So for example, if you do it through excessive flexion, And again, some people have got far greater tolerance to flexion than others, again, partially because of their genetics. If we delaminate collagen through flexion, so when we flex, we bend forward, so we create a compressive force on the front end of the disc. All that does in turn, it creates an equal and opposite force to force nucleus in the disc out this way. And it starts to worm its way through, they actually call it a nuclear worm its way through the layers of the delaminated disc until we get out to the back. We end up with a bulge, and if it progresses even further, eventually we'll have a full-blown herniation, where we now have nuclear fluid from inside the disc leaking out towards where obviously our nerves are, and all that wonderful kind of sciatic type pain and all that sort of stuff starts to occur. So people with a ovoid shaped discs have a far greater tolerance to doing that sort of bending and twisting before that sort of damage occurs. Someone who has a limacon shaped structure has far less. So we need to be careful. If we've got someone with a limacon type structure, they're obviously genetically better suited for sports that require less movement but more stiffness and stability. So if you've got someone limacon shaped structure, generally a lot of people will sort of edge towards stuff they're better suited at, and they want to become a power lifter. What we need to be careful with the discs is that if you want a disc to be strong, to bear great compressive force, we want to make sure we're not doing excessive flexion so that we're delaminating and weakening the collagen fibers around that disc and that annulus fibrosus. Because if we do that, we're now going to increase the chances of them getting a disc bulge or a herniation, or possibly even annular tear, things like that. So again, with the disc, we've got to be careful that we don't put things through too much twisting and flexion unless we really need to. And if we do, we have to understand the kind of the risks, the sort of injuries that we're going to pick up. So again, if you've got someone who wants to be stiff and strong for their sport, you don't need to put them through hundreds of cycles of flexion. There's literally no need to do it. In actual fact, it will start to be a detriment to their performance when we see later on as to how the vertebrae and the muscles adapt as well. So again, the discs, got to be careful. There's got to be a bit of a trade-off, and what we don't want to do is have a delaminated disc, then put lots of compressive force through, because that's just asking for trouble. Now, what are actual adaptations at the vertebrae? And there's a couple of big ones we need to take into account. So again, what we need to, if we're looking at someone who wants to be a powerlifter or a strongman, one of the things we're going to be careful of is allowing the body enough time to adapt to withstanding compressive force. So what that means is between the actual vertebrae and the discs, in here we have what we call end plates. And the end plates are what knit the actual disc to the vertebra, but also obviously they keep the nucleus inside and stop it from trying to leak up at some point. If we have someone who's done an excessive amount of compressive trauma on their spine, it hasn't had adequate time to heal, because that's what it does. When we train, we're creating trauma. So whether it's muscular or to the hard tissues, we need to let those tissues recover so that we don't generate injuries for ourselves. So for a lot of people, and this is one of the tests that I can do with provocation tests, by just getting someone to hold some weight in front of them, I can tell if they've got some compressive damage. And what happens is that when you're shoving compression down through the spine, and it's not getting enough chance to recover and adapt to it, you start to damage the growth plates here inside these end plates. And what happens is you can actually get a leak from the disc into the vertebra here, like that. And that gives you a very particular sort of pain, kind of deep within the bone, because you are leaking out, nucleus from your disc into your vertebra. So what we need to be careful of is when we're designing programs, and we talk about, kind of peaking things and then backing things off again, particularly for compressive-based athletes, so again, things like strongman, powerlifters, we need to make sure that, when we go for a training cycle, we create this damage, but then we need to back off a little bit to let these structures in here heal and adapt So when we go ready for the next phase, that we know there's not a damage, that we're going to break stuff so much that we start to get these compression fractures in here and leak out fluid into the actual vertebra. And again, that will cost you over time. That's going to cost you not only a lot of pain, but also disc height, which further on down the line can give you problems with your facet joints as well. So again, with the vertebra, compression damage here, we need to be careful to let these structures between the discs and the vertebra adapt to and get strong enough to withstand those high compressive forces and not let that disc leak out. Another thing we need to look at as well, for example, so obviously on your spine, we talk about sort of core musculature. We always got the muscles that people think about, things like, obliques, transverse abdominis, that sort of stuff. We've also got muscles that sit in between the individual joints in the spine, and their job is to lock that spine together, again, to help us generate stiffness when we need to. For example, one of the muscles we need to look at is multifidus, and that's one of the things, if someone does a heavy deadlift and all of a sudden they round their back at some point, there's probably an issue with multifidus somewhere, whether it's a signaling proprioception issue or an actual strength issue. But these muscles here that lock the spine together also need time to get strong, and as they get stronger, they put more force and load onto the transverse processes here, these bony bits here where they attach. So what happens over time, another kind of adaptation that happens in the actual vertebra, is that these transverse processes here will thicken and calcify and become stronger so that they can bear more load from these muscles going through them. So again, if you're familiar with the work of Professor Stuart McGill, you know that he took cadavers from prisoners who had life sentences. So all they could do in their spare time was literally just work out. And he noticed that in their spines, these transverse processes here were sort of thickened to become a lot stronger in adaptation to all the lifting that they were doing, versus say somebody who doesn't do a lot of exercise, who had very thin, spindly transverse processes that wouldn't take a great load before they sort of became damaged. So again, this is another thing we need to let the spine, this part of this idea of bone remodeling, is we need to let these transverse processes get thicker and stronger as well, so that the muscles here that generate the stability between the individual joints have got nice strong anchor points to bear great load and generate that stiffness that we need. Obviously someone who wants to do sort of bending and twisting and flexibility, they're not going to have that sort of adaptation, so they're going to have much thinner transverse processes, again, that don't need to bear great load. But if you force someone who had very thin transverse processes and very sort of low tolerance to compression forces to suddenly start lifting very heavily, very regularly without that time for adaptation, you're going to start to get problems in these areas. So again, that's how the vertebrae starts to adapt. And what we'll also look at now is look at a bit more detail how the actual muscles in between the joints adapt and how we need to be careful of those. So I mentioned before that the muscles here, again, if we're training for stiffness, so again, things like deadlifts, squats, and lifting heavy weights, these muscles here that lock the joints together need to get stronger and thicker, so they can lock everything together and make it more stable. One thing we need to be very careful of, and again, I'm starting to do this a little bit, so I've got a few clients that I'm trying to kind of correct some problems, is that in these muscles here, particularly things like multifidus, they've got a high density of what we call muscle spindles. So muscle spindles are basically cells that help the nervous system, the proprioception of the nervous system, know where those joints are in space and time. So if one of them becomes unstable for a split second, it can react quick enough to lock it together. So with provocation testing, if someone's got an issue with these muscles, this proprioception, these muscle spindles being kind of out of sync, usually you'll see it on like a compression test. We get someone to come up onto their toes and then drop as hard as they can onto their heels to send that shockwave through the spine, and it'll make one of the joints, if it's loose, rattle. And if these muscles are kind of out of sync, they don't react quickly enough to stabilize it. And I've had people that have had very strong reactions. They've almost been sick and and kind of buckled to their knees for a split second, and it's settled. That's what that is. It's a kind of an out of sequence of that proprioception or instability in that joint. So if we have someone who wants to be stiff and strong and bear great load, we don't want them to be in lots of flexion and stretching for two reasons. One is if we start to stretch these muscles, some of them have a very elastic nature. So once you start to sort of stretch them, it's actually harder to get them to go back to the other way, to the adaptations that we want. So again, we've inadvertently programmed in a weakness into the spine, when really the needs of the sport or the goal that we're training for requires it to be stiff and stable and strong. The other thing is as well, because of the muscle spindles, if you start to stretch these muscles out, that's what creates that kind of that nanosecond delay in that proprioception, and that's what tends to make people kind of sensitive to those kind of heel drop tests, that sudden compressive force, because the joints, the muscles can't react quite quickly enough. They're a little bit of a split second behind the peak of the force, and that's what gives it that little rattle, and it freaks the nervous system out because it knows it's not very stable in there. So again, I've got people that are trying to do deadlifts and squats, and they've been given all these sort of weird stretches to increase lumbar flexion, which then means we try and get them to squat and deadlift heavy. They either hit a complete kind of like plateau with their strength, they can't get any further, or they actually start to pick up discogenic injuries because the spine can't now no longer lock itself properly in the way it should. So again, we have to, on that spectrum, we have to be clear of where we want to be on that spectrum and how we want the body to adapt to thrive at one of that spectrum versus the other. Again, a lot of people get themselves into damage, into trouble, I should say, and create damage by, for example, wanting to be stiff and strong and bear great load, but then also have a very bendy, twisty spine at the same time. And again, opposite ends of the spectrum, completely different adaptation processes that are going on. So it's very hard for your body to adapt. It's the old maxim of trying to chase two rabbits at the same time that are going in opposite directions. It's not a good idea. And in terms of spine, what happens is not only do you limit your performance, but the more you try and pull yourself in two opposite directions, your risk of injury starts to become far greater. So again, when we pay attention to continuum, we pay attention to the adaptations that we want in the spine, we understand how we have to kind of, pick our specialization. And that's what's going to allow us to thrive at our goals in our sport, but also reduce the risk of injury. So again, think about the continuum, think about where your sport and your goals are on that continuum in terms of stiffness versus flexibility. And then we have to pick the appropriate exercises or tools to promote the appropriate adaptations in the spine so that we can thrive at the things we want to do and again reduce injury.